You guys can sit. I'm just going to stand to start with.
That wasn't actually a timer for you. It was my cat.
Oh.
I think we're still good.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And we have an online presence there, hopefully, that are tuning in as well, and we're recording this. Like all of the sessions, I'm really excited about that. I'm holding this little gizmo here because this is the speaker, and I'm going to have to pass it back and forth between Jess and myself, but nonetheless, we'll be fine that way. So we have a presentation and lots of time for discussion, questions, and some answers. And we're really excited. This is a really exciting time period right now for all of us, especially at Fort Monroe. And for many of the individuals in this room, a lot of work has gone into this. And I think at the same time, besides having an opportunity to reflect back, I'm really excited to be able to record a little bit of the journey as everybody's been going through this as well. So I want to first have everybody introduce themselves. So I am Françoise Bonnell. I'm the Director of Museums, Education, and Interpretation. I am responsible for a little of everything around here. But I can say probably the largest amount of my work has been dedicated over the last year to helping bring about the African Landing Memorial and bringing to fruition at least this first step, this first part of the sculpture elements, which is the figures, which will be formally unveiled on Saturday. So much of my work for this project has been doing a lot of the historical research. I'm not the historical expert. I seek out all the answers and the primary sources and from the historians and from the members of the descendant community, people who have been keeping the history going for a very long time, and then synthesize a lot of that, make some sense out of it. And I'm on a 24/7 recall to the artist, to Brian Owens. So when he has a question, I jump and I try to get him the answers the best that I can, as quickly as I can, as he moves through the project. So you're going to hear a little bit about that process as we go through. So I'm going to pass this over to Jess, who's going to introduce herself.
I'm Jess Meadows. I'm the Education Programs Manager here for Fort Monroe Authority. So my role is all educational needs when it comes to individuals experiencing things on our landscape, but in our exhibits. But specifically when it comes to the African Landing Memorial Project, it's been the research components and making sure that we are truly understanding all of the aspects of the portions of the memorial itself, all of the different components. And again, we'll talk a little bit about some of those today, but the research behind it and the reasoning for decisions and educating the public in those different decisions that have been made along the way. And also working with the descendant communities and understanding their needs and their history and their research in all of this as well. And then taking that not just here, but outside of here as well. I go on the road sometimes. I go out to schools. I go out to other institutions and talk with them about the project that we have been doing. So I usually am running around. For those that have been here at Fort Monroe and you see me running with different groups, that's usually me out on the landscape. And now I get the lovely opportunity to actually teach at the memorial itself and talk with groups there. So that's been a really amazing process that has developed over the past 5 years since I've been here. So I'm going to pass it next to Samantha, our lovely expert with us from Jamestown.
Oh, I'm set.
Oh, you're never mind. I forgot.
So in my capacity here, I consulted on the clothing of the figures. In my day-to-day work, I am the Historical Clothing Services Coordinator for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation up in Williamsburg. That means that I am in charge of researching, creating, maintaining all of the historical clothing that our interpreters wear in our recreated historical outdoor areas. And that spans 2 centuries and many different cultures, all the cultures that converged in this area in the 17th and 18th centuries.
And then I also wanted to introduce Elizabeth Bostelman from Jamestown as well. She is here with some things outside. So as you were coming in, you might have seen with the table. Elizabeth is JYS Community Engagement Manager. And she was actually just out, I think you're saying you were at Farmville all day yesterday, out and about. Talking about some of this history, especially from their perspective with all of us. So we're really happy to have her. So if you're here in the room, please stop by. She has some amazing touch items that also go with what we are discussing during our community forum today. So I'm really happy, again, really happy with the partnership that we have in general, but also that they're joining us in all these different capacities. So thank you all.
So the title, The Story in the Stitches, probably doesn't really completely explain what we were hoping to accomplish tonight. We have been working with the African Land Memorial, the artist, and the content personally 6 years now, more closely the last 3 years. And I have come to realize that this is, in fact, a journey. But when you are working with public art being put onto a public landscape, telling a very personal story and an important story, it requires a little bit of patience, as well as a little bit of, how would we say, taking constructive criticism through the process. And so I'm hoping with the questions that you'll have, and I'm probably going to ask for you just to hold on to the questions towards the end after a little bit of this, because then I can pass this around and everybody will be able to hear it. But the idea of the story and the stitches is really about the clothing that is being worn by the figures on the plaza today. So I thought I'd start with, I'm going to have to turn around and look. I'm a stand-up person, so it's a little bit harder for me here as well. So the African Land Memorial here at Fort Monroe consists of three parts, three elements. And one is the relief, and this will be a very large part of the plaza, 35 feet wide, 9 feet tall. And its purpose is really to tell the truth and the complete story and the narrative, originating in the kingdom of Ndongo and Congo, from which the first enslaved Africans came, all the way through to approximately 5 to 6 years later, and the impact of them on the Virginia colony. So the second part are the figures, and we're going to be talking a lot about that this evening, and I'll come back to that here in a moment. And lastly, the arc. So the arc is designed to evoke sort of a struggle, as well as to exemplify the triumph of the individuals and the legacies of these individuals. And it's also meant to be interpreted based on what somebody has finally felt from their experience on the landscape. So the arc is not part of that historical context and the historical storytelling that's here, but it's meant to be front and center in terms of people walking away with something that they have seen or they've experienced that has made something and made a difference to them. So on Wednesday, we had the privilege of placing the figures on the African Land Memorial. So that's what we'll be focusing on this evening. So the figures, as you'll see them here, both of these photographs taken by staff on Thursday morning, is inspired by the true story of Antony, Isabella, and their baby William. The story, without going into a lot of the history, I do want to point out, so Antony and Isabella landed here on the White Lion in August of 1619 and were situated in the household of Captain William Tucker, who is the commander of Fort Monroe, or at the time Point Comfort, and their child William was born and baptized, the first child of African descent, born and baptized in English North America, who was named William. And it's really important to point this out because there's no doubt that story and what Brian the sculptor heard from the family, from the Tucker family, inspired him to create what is now our portion of our memorial, which is a man, a woman, and a child. And I'm very excited. We do have Carolita, who's in our audience today, who hopefully also in the question and answer period will talk to us maybe a little bit about that. And she is a descendant of Anthony Isabella and baby William Tucker. And I don't know, I wasn't sure if anybody else was here, but I also want to say that Yola Dance, who is here, who is part of the 250th, the title escapes me, but the National 250th. But she was the former superintendent at Fort Monroe National Monument, and she and I worked very closely together on this project for several years while she was here as we developed the themes. And then it's really exciting also to have Melinda, who is in the back there next to Aaron, who is the president, or president of Project 1619, for whom much of the work in the early years of the memorial were put together. So I'm very humbled to have three of probably the most important people I've worked with over the years in the room as we go and discuss a lot of this. So just a little bit about Brian. This is Brian Owens. He is the artist. He's been sculpting and painting for probably close to 30 years. He is a generational African-American artist. His father was the one who initially inspired him into this work. So he is an artist, so he draws and he paints and he also sculpts. And I chose a couple pictures from my last trip in August down to the studio. I spend a lot of time with Brian, either on the phone or on text messaging or at the studio or at the foundry. And one of the things that he said very early on is that he's inspired by the stories and the individuals and the art and how it is represented. But he also understands his role is to create something that resonates with people who are experiencing it. And so his quote, "Art is not something I do, it's who I am." He takes that very much to heart. And also he says, "I didn't choose to be an artist, but it chose me." And that's really what motivates him through the process. I can tell you also he's a realist. So that means that since he's not an abstract artist, the things that he sculpts or he draws are very precise. And this is what sent us to the drawing board a couple times with a lot of the parts of the project that he's working on. And you can tell from this photo, I selected this one. He's actually sitting in the backside of the relief in the studio as he's contemplating the creation of the figures. And he's just looking to see what speaks to him, what places, what inspires him in all of that. And then I did have a series of photos as he moved through working with the final approved maquettes, as well as the figures there, thinking every step of the way, even to the very, very end, what have I done? And have I done it just perfectly, the way that one would anticipate it to come through? So it's very interesting to work with a sculptor. And although we're not talking about him actually sculpting, the precision in which he wants to recreate what he is presenting to the public also means the exactness is copied oftentimes in his sculpture. And that's what I think Samantha's going to be sharing with us here as well. So I say it's all in the details. It requires meticulous research, and that's meticulous research on the part of Brian. Oftentimes I'd get a call, a question about, well, I'm supposed to put stitches on this. So exactly what would the stitches have looked like in the 1620s? Oops, okay, so let me go find an answer for that. But he also is always looking for details because he wants the sculpture to be interesting. So if you're wondering why they're standing in a certain pose, well, there's a reason. It provides movement and action. And he also wants to have a little bit of creative license in this. So you'll notice that she is wearing a head scarf, which would have been what women at that time in Virginia would have worn. However, he wanted to make sure it had the elements of the feelings of the origins of the figures, and that is why he opted for an African, style in order to put on her head. So would she have actually been wearing that? We don't know. Was it exactly that style? Not sure. But nonetheless, that's what he talks about when he talks about his creative license. And then finally, he wants to make sure that it resonates with all of the people who are seeing it. So what I see versus what you might see, what you take away from what he has sculpted, may be very different, and that's okay. He's told us and our interpretive staff, when you're out there on the plaza, don't talk, just listen and watch and answer questions, because everybody has to experience every aspect of that as well. So those were some of the things that I took away from the process that we're going to discuss. So it started off with some early conceptual designs. The picture on the right is the first one I saw when I was sitting in this room, and I think it was probably January, February of 2021. And this was the initial concept inspired by Antony, Isabella, and their baby William. And you'll notice the sculpture is somewhat different from what was actually ended up being sculpted. But of course, I was looking at the details. And as we were sitting there, somebody in the audience said, wait a minute, he's wearing coveralls. They didn't wear coveralls in Virginia in 1620. It's like, no, they didn't. But what he wanted to share with people is this was sort of the idea. That is the concept of a mother and a father and a child for which they're looking at adoringly. At the time, he was grasping for a cowrie shell. But again, some of this changed as well. And then finally, he also was looking at, from this drawing, those early maquettes. He's now not in the coveralls anymore, which was good, but these are just very, very early renderings and drawings from it. So it's always amazing to me to see this and to see now what the product is. So what did we do and where did we go? Well, knowing that the coveralls weren't correct, we needed to figure out ways in which we could provide for him some imagery. And that's a little bit hard. There's a lot of early imagery of the first Africans in 1619. In fact, there's a picture, I think, from the 1880s that depicts them fully clothed, kneeling down, having just landed, and come off the ship of the White Lion. Well, we even discuss, were they even clothed? So there's some misconceptions about what they might have looked like or how they might have been dressed. But we turned to Jamestown initially. And so what we were pointed to was this 1620 census, which was a mural they had at the Jamestown settlement. And it really, as I'm told, captured all of the different people in the different statuses within colonial structures and social classes, and also reflected the kinds of work they did. And so we studied it, and we studied it, and we studied it. And then he said, well, tell me what you think it should look like. And so we started sort of dabbling in a little bit of that. And it's from this that we ended up with the first maquette. And that's what we ended up with. So the first maquette, the first figures, although according to the census and the fact that we had placed this in a family with a head of household, in this case, Captain Tucker, would have been appropriate, we had immediate feedback about it. Thank you for being here, Randall, another Tucker family member. So I'm going to pass this off to Jessica, who's going to talk a little bit about how we developed the feedback that we got and then how we ended up back at Jamestown again.
With kind of going in after the first maquettes, so maquette being a scale model, the maquettes that we have are, they were cast and 3D printed and with resin and then coated. They were unveiled during a Board of Trustees meeting and then unveiled also to the public. And around that time, we were also having community engagement sessions. And so during those community engagement sessions, particularly we were working with a partner for interpretive planning, Lord Cultural Resources. And so the picture was from one of our affinity group meetings that we had during this process. And during these community engagements, we had discussions on the maquettes and the first version. Immediately, some of the feedback that we heard had a lot of questions of why. Why do they look that way? What are they wearing? Why did you choose to look like that? For them to look like that, and primarily it was they look too English. They looked rich instead of in servitude or in bondage. Then we also had, again, questions. So one of the biggest questions, should the faces have different features? And in this case, what are we looking at, features of an African-American individual, more of what we see today, or are we looking and trying to look at more of the origin? And so looking at someone that has more Angolan features, since again, we do know that the majority of the individuals first brought here in 1619 were taken from the region that is established today as the country of Angola. Like Francoise mentioned, one of the things was the head wrapping. We understood, and looking at our primary research, we understood that yes, there were women that wore head wrappings to cover their hair in some way or fashion, but was that actually correct? Was that something that a woman in servitude should have on, or a woman in bondage, and even is it something that an African individual would have done here in Virginia, in the colony, when they were brought here? So that was a major question for us. And again, that kind of overarching look and feedback that we got is that they did not look to be in servitude or in bondage. And so it was very eye-opening for us with the primary research we had done, and especially looking, one of the main things especially that we had been looking at as part of this research, again, were the experts. We need to go to the sources. We need to go, who are the experts in the field? And so like Francoise mentioned, is we had really gone through Jamestown. Well, we said, actually, we need to go to Jamestown. We need to go and talk to them rather than just simply using their resources and having what we know. We need to seek out the experts and ask the questions, and asking especially about options, about what individuals, especially Africans, brought to the Virginia colony. What would they have been wearing in the Virginia colony? Again, we understand that when they were taken from the region that we know today as Angola, and with the what would later be fully established as the transatlantic slave trade, that they would have been stripped of everything. So, but when they were brought here and placed into the Virginia colony, again, what would they have been wearing? What would that have told us? So Francoise and myself, we went on trips. We went on research trips, and we went up and met with Samantha and Chris and the interpretation team, as well as some of the cultural history experts, and really trying to get a really great understanding of what was life like in the Virginia colony at the point of 1619, 1620, and specifically for the first Africans and others that were brought here.
So I want to also point out that we had a lot of questions, because what we realized after the first set of maquettes is how much we didn't know, and how much we didn't understand, and how much we didn't really take into consideration the reflection of our community, and of course those stories and histories that we're telling. And so we relied heavily on other experts within the community. We relied also on feedback from the Tucker family. And I think that what was most eye-opening to all of this was not only that there are experts, and there is a lot of knowledge, like we're finding out, but also that it's a very fascinating type history. And that's what I'm hoping Samantha will share with us a little bit about the decisions that were made, and how colonists clothed themselves, clothed their servants, clothed everybody, and what that spoke to as a society as a whole in those first 5, 10, 15 years within the colony as well. So I think we're going to turn it over to...
So just to back off of that, for the household, again, part of our research was looking at the household here in particular. So this is, again, part of some of our preliminary research. So these are from the muster rolls, so your census record of the time, list of living and dead. And in particular here, the one on your right, I have to, again, facing this way, shows the household of Captain William Tucker. And so this is, again, here at Point Comfort. So this is where we see listed here at the bottom with Antony, Isabella, and their baby William, as well as an indigenous man that was also in servitude in their household, the man William Crawshaw. So this is, again, we were really trying to understand what was going on for those placed into the household, and what was, and again, we later learned the full responsibility of other individuals like Captain William Tucker, the head of these households, and what their role was for having those in bondage in their homes. So now I'm going to turn everything over to Samantha. Again, we got to really nerd out a lot in this process, and I've learned way more about clothing than I think I ever anticipated. So I'm going to turn everything over to Samantha.
Okay. So in my work for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, I am a maker. I'm making the clothing, but I also consider myself first and foremost a historian of dress. And my approach when studying clothing in order to recreate it is really rooted in the idea, as this talk was so beautifully titled, The Story in the Stitches. What can the surviving objects, in my case, the clothing, tell us about the people of the past? Because especially for marginalized communities, whether that is the enslaved Africans, poor whites, indigenous peoples, we don't often have their voice in the historical record. We don't have any writings that were kept. So what we have left are the things that they left behind. And so I love being able to study those things, because in studying them, we can hear their voices, and we can get a sense of what their material life was like, what their physical life was like. And oftentimes that leaves us with an even more tangible connection to history than just hearing words. We can literally feel, hold, touch something that they touched. And what is more intimate than clothing? It's something that we still experience today. It's something that we have a very personal connection to. And people of the past also had a very personal connection, even in the case of people like Antony and Isabella, who were not afforded the agency to choose what they were wearing. Even though those clothes were forced upon them, that's still telling a story. It's still telling something about them and their place now within the English society. So I was very excited to hear that the artist was such a realist and was going to be so focused on the details, because that's what I do every day, is making sure we're using the right stitches, making sure the fabrics that we use are the fabrics that would have been used in the time period, making sure we're using patterns taken from the few surviving garments that exist, so that everything can be as right as possible. Because if our interpreters train to give the right information to guests, the buildings that they're in, we're studying and we're building those by hand, the clothing should be able to support those stories as well. So I care very deeply about the interpreters at our sites wearing clothes that can themselves be a teaching tool, because the fidelity to that history, even through clothing, which I think can kind of easily be dismissed as, oh, they're just wearing old-timey clothes. But all of those clothes can be a tool and a window to the past. So knowing that the artist was going to see all of the details and see the same minute things that I care about was really exciting. You get to like nerd out with him long distance about he cares about how is this bow tied, how should this be done? And so that was really gratifying to share that level of passion about getting the details right. And so I guess to start with with the male figure's clothing, you can see in these images a lot of the real texture details, because the clothing, especially for this class of people, very working class, there's so much beautiful texture in there that Brian was able to translate. And we talked a lot about shoes.
Yes.
And the fascinating thing about shoes in the early 17th century is that for the most part, men and women wear the same style of shoe. There isn't like an obviously like male or female style. And so there's an example of the shoe here. The straps that tie on the top of the foot are called latchets. And they're tied during this time period. So we don't have buckle shoes, but we'll get there in the 18th century. But it's those kind of details that were really important. And it's kind of hard to see because of how dark things are here, but there were even garters to hold up the stockings. Because if you didn't have garters, your stockings would be down around your ankles and it would be very annoying. And you can see some of the beautiful knitted texture in the stockings there as well. And so the man who's wearing the clothes in these images, his name is also Brian, all of the dirt that's on there is honest dirt. He has come by that honestly. He was doing blacksmithing, firing the weapons, so you get gunpowder on everything, and all of the holes that myself and my team then fix have all been earned. And it's that kind of wear and tear that we were able to bring into the figures to speak to the harsh labor that they would have been enduring. And we didn't have to make it up. Like it was there in the fabric to be replicated in the figures. So more of the incredible details. I think we got really excited about the buttons because there is a huge variety of buttons in the 17th century, and especially on men's clothing, there are tons of buttons everywhere. And we're fortunate that at historic Jamestown, at the Jamestown Rediscovery, the archaeological site, they have found hundreds and hundreds of buttons, have cataloged hundreds and hundreds of buttons. So we're able to, use very close reproductions, even make buttons ourselves. So the images here on the far right are thread wrapped around a wooden core. And I brought an example of that with me for you to take a look at and touch. And it's easy to kind of think like, well, that must have been only for wealthy people. In the 17th century, labor is cheap. And, they probably are having children wrap these. So they were accessible. And we thought it would just be an incredible detail to have because it provided so much excellent texture in the buttons themselves. But metal buttons, which could be cast by the hundreds, are showing up at Jamestown in the archaeological record as well. And one of the changes that jumps out to my eye was that in the first maquette, Antony's breeches are very slim and fitted to his leg, whereas a more accurate silhouette for this time period would be for them to be fuller and looser. So that was something that we were able to change in this process to give a more correct silhouette, because that's one of the things that first immediately jumps out to my eye is the silhouette for the period right, because that changes throughout history. In deciding what he should wear, I was really struck by the feedback of the community, particularly that he looked too English, or they looked too English, and that they looked, too well off. Mm-hmm. And I definitely agreed with that. And it was really satisfying to be able to go to primary images of Europeans working in fields to see what they would have been wearing. And even though these men would not be considered appropriately dressed to do anything but work at this moment, they are, appropriately dressed for the task at hand. So they are wearing the bare minimum amount of clothing to be considered clothed in the early 17th century, which is to say they're wearing their white linen shirt and breeches, which could be either made out of a hard-wearing linen canvas, which is what a lot of Jamestown men wore because linen was cooler for a Virginia climate than back in England, or they could be made out of wool, which would be good for winter. But the linen shirt, even though it's a very simple garment to construct, it forms the core of every person's daily wardrobe. It's the first thing that you put on, and it's the thing that is a really important process of hygiene in the 17th century. It's a well-known, almost myth at this point, that Europeans didn't bathe. And in a way, it's true. They didn't bathe the same way that we do. What they did was they used linen clothing and a frequent change of linen clothing to absorb the sweat and dirt and oils of the body. You remove that linen shirt, you can wash that, you can boil it and scrub it, and then you put a clean shirt on, and that's keeping your body clean. So it's just a different way of going about things. May or may not be comfortable with that today, but that is why a simple shirt is so important, because it is part of keeping your body clean and keeping yourself healthy. But these images were just a really great example, the sort of that evidence, if you will, to say, okay, this is something that we can root in history and it makes sense for Antony, and then move forward with that. So in the first maquette, he was wearing a very fitted either doublet or jerkin over his shirt. And so now we can say, well, here's a historical example of what he could actually be wearing when he is often laboring, like the men in these images. So this was our Brian wearing the clothes that informed a lot of what was in Antony's. And you can see much better all of the wear and tear on these clothes, and how voluminous, especially the shirt is, because it does need to be big enough to cover all of your body. What you can't see when he's wearing breeches is that it also comes down to his knees, because it also is acting as his underwear for the lower part of his body. We don't have drawers in this time period. You're using your shirt for everything. And so you can see on the far right is an example of an over garment that he could be wearing over his shirt. And that was something that we did think about. But the shirt, really spoke to the kind of labor that Antony would have been doing. And again, thinking about the stories that are being told, made for a better story that addressed the concerns that the community have of he doesn't appear to be in bondage. So to move on to Isabella, again, in the initial maquette, she is wearing what in the period would have been called a waistcoat, or a jacket we might think of today, and a skirt or petticoat. And, again, addressing looking too wealthy, looking too neat and put together. So what would a woman who is working worn? And where I always start looking at images from the time period, and these are from the late 16th and early 17th century. So it would not have been a very stylish or cutting edge garment, but something that she could have worn, that forms the basis of all women's clothing, which is a garment called a kirtle, or it eventually becomes called a petticoat. But it's kind of like a dress. It has the bodice that laces up and a skirt attached to it. And that is what all women are wearing underneath their outer clothing to give support to the chest. And it just so happens that all of these images are red, and that was actually the most common color for this garment. There was a belief that red was a very healthy color, so you wanted to wear that closer to your body. But again, in the same way that thinking about the kind of work Antony would have been forced to do and how could his clothes support that, for Isabella, this is what a hard-working woman would have worn. She doesn't have anything inhibiting her arms the way the waistcoat would. She has free range of motion because there's no sleeves other than her white linen undergarment, which is called a smock in the early 17th century. So it's the women's equivalent of the shirt, performing the same function of helping to keep people clean to the extent that it does. And they all have coverings over their chest as well, which in the time period is called a partlet, also made out of linen. But it added a lot more visual interest as well, since the artist is so incredible at creating that detail. We wanted to really intentionally give him a lot of detail that he could put into the figures. And so choosing things like having an apron, like having the separate chest and neck covering, just helped create more visual details for him to include. And speaking of apron, from a historical standpoint, women who were working pretty much almost always would have been wearing an apron, covering the front of their kirtle. And so that also, again, was going to be one more layer to add details as well. And one thing that you might notice when looking at the figure is that we chose a very distinct style of apron from the early 17th century, which is basically just this square or rectangle of fabric that has ties stitched to it, because it's really easy to clean. It doesn't have a bunch of gathers in it that could trap dirt and everything. It just gets washed and ironed easily. But these show a lot of the details that were able to be put into those into Isabella's figure. The way that the bodice of the kirtle is laced is very particular. So this is different than we often lace things today, where you're crossing the ends of a string back and forth. In the early 17th century, it was common to what they call straight lace or spiral lace. So you're taking one string and looping it back and forth through the laces. So it creates, here, you can see it where there's a gap, a zigzag pattern as well. But all of these holes, called eyelets, are sewn by hand, so you can see all the stitches. And when you get close to the figures, you can see every single one of those stitches. Another small detail, having the apron tied in front, was very common in this time period as well. And you'll also notice, I love that he even included the stripes at the bottom of the petticoat, which are called guards. They were a type of decoration, but they could also disguise the fact that this skirt could have been made longer and then let out over time as a person grew, or it could be altered for another family member if they were taller or shorter. Ways to make these clothes, which would have been so precious and cost so much and been so valuable, to extend the life of them, would have been important to everybody, but especially to Antony and Isabella. And so to be able to imbue the choices with that kind of meaning was really special. But yeah, that was pretty good.
So another thing, for one of the other things that we learned, especially with you and Chris and the whole team, one was obviously like how precious the clothing was. And again, that it was something that you needed to use as much as you could for as long as you could. So as someone grew, extending the kirtle, the skirt of the kirtle, but also the darning for any sort of tears. So darning being your stitching and repair done, and how you would have as much darning as possible until you couldn't anymore, honestly.
Absolutely.
But also if you could just kind of briefly talk about the importance of that clothing in terms of the role for the head of the household and what that meant for someone like Captain William Tucker's responsibility for individuals like Antony Isabella or anyone else in his household or any other master of a household in the Virginia colony.
Yeah. So they do have a responsibility to provide for the people in their household, and that includes family members, servants, and enslaved people. You are providing everything for them. And that is a reflection in English society of their status. If you can't provide those things, you don't have the power and the wealth to back that. So it is very important that you are able to demonstrate that through providing these things for the people in your household. And that's not just clothing, although that is a huge part of it, but you're responsible for their food, their clothing, and shelter. And a lot of times just prior to this, there are stores or magazines from which people can draw from to provide for folks. And that could either come in the form of just textiles that could be made into clothes, or there was quite a lot of clothing that was mass produced so that it could be a little more easily distributed to people in the Virginia colony. We see the Virginia Company importing vast quantities of textiles and ready-made clothing into the colony because it was so important to provide that for them. One kind of misconception is that everybody made their own clothes in the 17th century, especially if you were poor. But when you think about it, especially if you're lower down on the social ladder, you don't have time to make your own clothing because you're cooking, you're cleaning, you are tending the garden on top of everything else. So it's cheaper, even at the lowest levels of society, to pay somebody who's skilled to make that clothing for you. And so a head of the household is going to seek the services of a tailor, and a tailor was one of the first people, first Englishmen to arrive in 1607 to be able to provide that clothing for his household. But it is a responsibility and a great investment as well, because the clothing is, I mean, it's expensive in the way that a car is expensive. It's something that we all need, but it's something that requires an incredible investment. So you take care of it for as long as possible. And that includes mending and darning, which is something that takes up a lot of my day-to-day time as well. But it really is an investment to be guarded, and it's something that can also be passed down. We see that very often in people's wills. You're leaving somebody clothing, and it's not just, you know, the wedding dress and things like that. It's something that they can actually use in their life moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, because that was one of the major feedbacks, and learning that factor really kind of set us in motion for how we interpret and how we discuss this and educate the public in the final decisions for what they are wearing today.
Right.
Is that, again, there is the importance of clothing, and that they are clothes for that reason, because it reflected on the individuals that they were put into their households for.
Yeah.
I was like, you can do it. I don't know.
So we're just kind of coming to the end here, and we'll take questions and things. So you will see the original maquette to the right. This is actually the maquette that's in one of our offices now. It will go into the collection as part of the process as we archive this whole project. And then you will see here really the sculpted maquette that was used to create the mold. And the clothing you see here, these items are the items that Jamestown Settlement gave us about a year ago, very graciously, that have been shipped back and forth to Brian several times, and they've now come home. They're going home.
They're going home tonight.
They're going home tonight too. But we were very lucky to have that. And so we sent extensive numbers of pictures of everything. He measured, we had a measure to see how far from the ground, from the shoe, the kirtle would have been. If you go out there, you'll see it's precise. It's exactly what it was that it would have been. So that aspect of realism was wonderful. It was also somewhat painstaking on the receiving end, but really it's attention to detail is what we were working for and working towards with all of that. So some of this are the artistic liberties. You'll notice the baby is swaddled very closely with his neck, where the wrap is up here. It's not completely natural. What would have been natural is it would have hung probably partly open, a little bit lower down. But that was one of the things that Brian had said with a sculpture. When it rains, the water will pool there, it will discolor it and destroy it. So he opted to put it a little bit higher as well. The shoelaces are a little thicker than the actual example because he's afraid, of course. And it's possible that people will pull at the shoelaces. And so he needed something a little bit stronger as well. There's a lot of darning and patchwork. It's intentional. You'll see that using some of the stitches that we were able to provide him some imagery in the different places that you had informed us would be worn. So it might be on the side of the pants, or it might be on the portion of the apron in the front. You won't see that on these materials, but that's what he added a little bit later. And then he used an extensive catalog of research he did on past and present day Angolan people from basically the Kwanzaa Norte or the Kwanzaa River area in Angola, which would have at the time been what I think is called the lands of Matamba. And so he used those features. And so the individuals he sculpted are not individuals per se that we would attribute a name to, but there are features that he actually worked for 6 or 7 days while everything was at the foundry finishing them. So the level of detail that he chose and the expertise that he used from the images, the books, and some of the sources that other artists had given him was pretty extensive. And then the textured fabric also. You'll see in one spot on the back of the shirt, there seem to be patterns, and people take different things away from those patterns. But he said, if I didn't put the patterns there, then it might be boring. It might just not be as interesting as it was, so I added them in. And he had actually seen that, an artist use that on a figures sculpture of Sojourner Truth. And so that's what he used as well. So, questions. That is sort of it in a nutshell. You're going to pass this around.
Yeah. So
I
if
wonder
you
what questions
have
or
any questions, I'll
comments
come with the mic so people on the live stream can hear.
Hello. I have 2 questions actually. So following up on something that was brought up earlier about the head wrapping, I see that the head wrapping remains, but what did you discover about the use of head wrappings at the time?
So for European women of this time period, it was customary to have your head covered, but the type of covering would have been different from what an African woman would have worn. So it was, really a conversation to have about, not having them look so English. And that was again where, I hesitate to call it creative license because it really is about fidelity to the story. So even though an African woman brought to Virginia at this time period would have probably been given, as she's given all of this English clothing anyway, given an English style head covering, it spoke better to her African identity to have this style of head wrap, which because we have so much less documentation on Africans in Virginia at this time period, we do see by the late 17th century, early 18th century, it is very much a common practice for enslaved women to wear their hair covered in a distinct style that is distinct to their culture. So that sort of informed this decision to have that.
Thank you. And relatedly, I guess on the topic of sort of their dress being informed by both African and European styles of dress, going back to the silhouettes you mentioned earlier with kind of the loose-fitted breeches, and of course by the 18th century we get with a more fitted pants. How did changes in European styles sort of influence the clothing that enslaved people might have been wearing?
So I can speak better to that from the 18th century just because we have more of a body of knowledge to that. But from the 17th century, at least from the few images that we have of people of African descent in European clothing, they are largely following European trends because that is the dominant culture in that instance. But particularly during the 18th century here in the British colonies, we see enslaved peoples putting their own spin on the clothing that they are essentially forced to wear. And there's documentation of them taking things and dyeing them different colors or adding a more unique way of patching. There's actually a reference to a man who has snake-shaped patches on one of his garments. So there are these very intentional acts of maintaining identity, but they're much more better documented in the 18th century. So you can kind of extrapolate a little bit, but I hesitate to put too much of the 18th century onto the 17th century.
I have a question also. You happen to mention the slaves that were in the home and that the plantation owner paid for everything they needed, the clothing and so forth. However, you didn't mention the people that are in the field.
Oh. So at this
There are
time,
two different sort of statuses.
So
you
at-
worked in the home or you worked in the field.
so at this time in the 17th century, especially this early, this is
Okay.
very, very early, you don't see that definition as much in this
Okay.
time. So in this time, everything, I hesitate to call, hundreds of acres smaller, but you're working in a much smaller household, you're living closer together, and there isn't the same division at this point. It will be.
People, they were there to perform, the plantation owner would raise tobacco,
Mhm.
basically, whatever they were growing. So didn't they also pay for the people that were laboring for them? That's what I'm asking you. It didn't
Free or
matter what
enslaved?
time, were they still taking care of not only the household, which reflected on the owners of the home?
Certainly. And I guess when we say household, we mean it not in a physical sense.
Yeah.
It's not physically enslaved people working within the physical house. It's the 17th century definition of a household.
Okay, that's
Where-
the difference.
yeah,
See, I'm
sorry.
thinking about that.
Right.
Okay, so they.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's
No,
speaking of it
that's
as,
correct.
right, it doesn't matter where they worked, but yeah.
That's what I
People in the home.
Yes,
Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah, and
I
I
got you too.
I wanted to point that out and this is the challenge, right? It's
Yeah.
a very narrow window. We decided with a memorial that it would be a 1619 to 1624, 25, maybe 1630 time period. And what I've learned a lot is what I have always thought previously about enslaved people and the divisions of labor and class within society is different. And much of what we are taught is the development of chattel slavery that comes later after the sort of the institutionalization of racism in the 1640s and 1660s. You start to see some of the relationships changing. That doesn't mean that these are wonderful, happy households. No, because clearly there's just strict divisions and all of that. But I do remember reading a document that talked in I think it was 1628 or 1630. It was a warning that was sent out by the colony, the Virginia colony, that said, you masters, head of households, remember, you have a responsibility to feed, clothe, and provide shelter for the people who are within your household. And actually the muster records show those households. And it didn't mean that it would all be equal between the individuals in that, but it was a responsibility that reflected that individual's master within the societal structure. There's an interesting story about a gentleman, an enslaved individual named Bass, who sues just as much many of the white indentured servants did in a court of law, complaining that he was not being fed nor clothed properly. And so he was removed from that household and he was put into Governor Yardley's wife's household, at which point then his past employment was compensated for. But so it was pretty serious, this idea of the clothing and the feeding and the housing. And I think that in itself becomes complicated in the larger story, but it also enriches what we learn and what we know about those early years. So.
Because things were not equal, everywhere.
Did anybody I think we have time for one more question, maybe? If anybody has a question?
If you had to describe a color for the clothing, and you try and make any indications, you said red was a specific color that folks would be using. There's only so much that we get from bronze. Is that not up to the person who's looking at it?
In all honesty, yes, it's really up to the individual. In having conversations with Brian, speaking really from the education realm of this and kind of how do we discuss this with the larger public, it's really up to your own understanding. It's up to your own interpretation based on an informed kind of decision process and kind of context. So that's part of our job, is really allowing the public to understand in their own realm and their own time of the history behind all of this, and giving them, like we have learned so much from Samantha and her team and everyone at Jamestown, of what was going on during the time period, the reality of the clothing and the colors and textures and fabrics and all of this, and helping that inform someone's own interpretation. And so Brian, being a realist, is very much under this kind of notion of, I have my realistic interpretation, but I also want everyone else to have their own. And so with the figures, it's very much, and like we were talking about, when you're out on the landscape and looking at the figures directly, and you see that pattern that he's etched in there, it is up to your own interpretation in his eyes of what that fabric really looked like, based on, again, what our informed knowledge and education, as well as your own.
All right, so thank you all.
Yeah,
for being
thank you
here,
so
and
much
thank
for
you very much,
coming.
Samantha.
Thank you. Thank you.
She does have a few things up here. If you want to
Yes.
take a look
Yeah.
at that.
And Elizabeth, again, also has the table outside, which has some of the raw fabric textiles as well.
And if you have other questions for her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll be here.
Is
Yes.
the